Okay, so in the 1888 authorized English translation of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, which was edited by Engels himself and a guy called Samuel Moore, there's a passage in the proletarians and communists sections of the manifesto that runs thus, which is really the kind of centerpiece of this talk. It reads, "The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement." So that's the kind of disputed passage of the Communist Manifesto that we're going to be kind of looking at this morning. Since this passage appeared in this particular 1888 translation, there's been a periodic tussle over its meaning. For some in Britain, particularly, and it's Britain that I'm going to actually concentrate on because it's the kind of area that I kind of know best. It will be interesting to hear how this kind of like a particular debate is panned out in other countries as well. But for some in Britain, particularly those who are keen on an orientation to the Labour Party, this particular passage that I've just quoted is used basically as an intellectual cover for opportunist kind of politics, really. Often by trot groups, basically whereby revolutionaries kind of cloak themselves in a reformist garb and decry any attempt to form separate communist parties. They decry any attempt to form separate communist parties as a sectarian kind of project. For others, such as myself, using this passage in this manner it's a severe misinterpretation of Marx and Engels. And in any case, as we'll see below, as pointed out by like a famous writer on the Communist Manifesto, Hal Draper, it rests on a severe mistranslation. That's Draper's basic contention that this was that this passage that appeared in the 1888 English version of the Communist Manifesto, that the communists do not form a separate party, etc. Draper just contends that that's just a mistranslation that's kind of crept in, but we'll go into the more detail of that below. Although this kind of passage has had influence, you know, you can there's some obvious trot groups that use this passage in this manner to argue that you need like strategic orientation. In their sometimes in their cases a mono adaptation to the Labour Party in favour of in contrast to forming a communist party. It's groups like Socialist Appeal and the AWL who tend to use this phrase in this manner to say we must remain in the Labour Party. You can't form a separate communist party, and to try and do so is sectarian or problematic. As a general point, I would kind of judge that the attempt to use this contested passage to justify a kind of mono adaptation to the Labour Party or reformist organisations in general, this is a case, I think, where it represents a kind of distinct under-theorization of this issue, in the sense that literally the people who tend to use this passage, they tend to latch onto this passage and they don't explore any of the terrain around it. They don't even seek to interpret the passage properly. And Mike McNair has commented often that the left has tended to over-theorize many issues. And I'm with Mike on some of this. For example, you see this all the time. Last year, a Trotskyist comrade told me that specific philosophies and aesthetics needed to be set out in a party program. And he also said that it was possible to forge a broad-based unity on specific disavowals of Kant's transcendental dialectic. Surprisingly, my trot friend doesn't have a group around him or that many friends even. But I think this is one issue in kind of contrast to that, where it hasn't really been over theorized at all. This issue of like forming a separate party in relation to the Communist Manifesto. It's actually been under theorized. it does kind of strike me that when you kind of look at the use of this passage, that if comrades were given a kind of basic kind of course in dialectics, um, that might help them unpick an abstract enterprise of like boiling down a theory of partyism to basically what is a few contested sentences. Although in some cases of Trotskyist comrades, even paying attention in GCSE English might have helped them in this kind of enterprise. So that's the kind of, so this is one where I think whereas in contrast to, where often like issues are like boiled down to complicated and abstruse concepts of philosophy, this is one area, it's just a kind of backwater that's just been fairly under theorized, I think, even though there is a kind of like rich kind of literature kind of dealing with this kind of issue. But this is a live issue. This is not some kind of dead issue of like historical interpretation. This is, for example, how Socialist Appeal justifies its making over of the tactic of Labour Party entry into a strategy, and also its disavowal of the supposed sectarianism of the early CPGB. Before quoting from the passage from the Communist Manifesto that I've already read out, Rob Sewell, who I think is, I don't know that much about Socialist Appeal, but I think Rob Sewell was one of their kind of leading kind of lights. Rob Sewell argues, both Marx and Engels explained that the task of the emancipation of the working class was the task of the working class itself. If the Marxists were going to influence the workers' movement, they should not set up their own sectarian barriers, but participate in the real movement and go through the experience shoulder to shoulder with the workers. So therefore, what this led in the history of this organization is these kinds of interpretations, which are a kind of makeover of an anti-sectarianism into the understanding of one particular kind of sect kind of interpretation of the world, that you should never ever leave the Labour Party and never form communist parties, which is the implication of this. So the more significant forerunners of Socialist Appeal, which was the militant group, obviously, they therefore used to deny to the world that they were a separate organisation, although it was a fairly easy job for journalists such as Michael Crick and the rest of the Labour movement to uncover the fact that Militant was not just a paper produced by Labour Party supporters, as it claimed, but it was the product of a specific and in fact partly separate organisation called the Revolutionary Socialist League. That was the group that was kind of at the core of kind of Militant. It's actually what Militant kind of was. So pretending that you are not a separate organisation, and thus relying on the disputed Communist Manifesto passage that we've outlined, it actually, in my mind, it concedes grounds to like witch hunts of Marxists in the Labour Party. In reality, this stance consigns you to a kind of endless game of nip and tuck with the Labour right, who will only be too happy to insist, like you, that you should not be a separate group. And at any time that your independent activity threatens to amount to anything, or if, as recently, the Labour leadership needs a kind of blood sacrifice in the form of groups like Socialist Appeal and others, you're going to always be under the cosh from that. Rather, the terms of the debate need to be changed so that, like the early CPGB, like unity and separateness are insisted upon, and the Labour Party returns partly to its foundations as a kind of a group of affiliated organisations that are not in hock to a central London dictatorship like the Parliamentary Labour Party. This is a direct illustration of how disabling this kind of misuse of Marx and Engels could be, and also this kind of attempt to kind of like to provide some theoretical underpinning for not forming separate communist parties. It's also in theoretical terms, it also reproduces the long historical problem of the Labour Party left in this country, which is constant adaptation to the right, constant feelings that it needs to be in step with the centre and the right of the Labour Party, and constant worries that it doesn't want to be seen as a kind of anything kind of separate. It's like, we're at one with you, and that was kind of obviously the most disabling thing about the recent kind of Corbyn I think we can call it a debacle now, because given its outcome, it was a complete debacle. But the part of that debacle rested upon this idea that we are not separate from the Labour right and the Labour centre. We haven't really got any separate identity. You know, we're just at one with those, and therefore that meant that Corbyn had to make a whole load of concessions. But that also, you know, that will also be the case of, that's also the case with groups like Militant and Socialist Appeal. The fact that Militant used to have to, like, you know, state at length that it wasn't a separate organisation, all that kind of does in the end is it just concedes grounds to kind of witch hunts, and it always makes you vulnerable to this charge that you're a separate organisation. Okay, so going into kind of more the background of it after that kind of scene setting, as I said earlier, one of the main kind of polemical thrusts against the idea of forming separate communist parties, as apart from the existing reformers working class parties, often takes the form of quoting the famous passage: "The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties," and so on. How well does this isolated contention stack up? Well, the first historical point is the most obvious one. The manifesto was the product of a communist organisation, the Communist League, and as Marx and Engels made clear in their preface to the German edition of 1872 of the Communist Manifesto, it was this organisation that commissioned Marx to write a detailed and theoretical and practical programme of the party in 1847 after its foundation in that year. The Communist League was formed through the merger of the League of the Just, headed by Karl Schapper, and the Communist Correspondence Committee of Brussels, Belgium, in which Karl Marx and Fred Engels were in which Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were involved. The Communist League was formally disbanded in November 1852, following the Cologne communist trial. But in the literature, there's quite a lot of contention about how the Communist League kind of fell out of existence. So that's the first point. So the Communist Manifesto was the product of a specific communist organisation. The actual title of what we know now as what's been abbreviated as the Communist Manifesto, the actual title was the Manifesto of the Communist Party. That was the actual title of the kind of work. So again, it doesn't really give much. It makes confusing the contention that the communists do not form a separate party. And so one can debate actually whether the Communist League was a party or whether it was a proto-party. But you can't really debate the more obvious intentions behind the manifesto, which have this kind of partyist kind of emphasis. The Soviet historian E.P. Kandel, who was writing in 1953, did argue, in fact, that the Communist League was a germ or nucleus of an intended real communist party, i.e., in other words, it was partyist, but not a party. Other sections of the manifesto do in fact give off this kind of sense of separateness that subsequent writers such as Kandel have outlined. For example, there's passages that read, the communists are distinguished from the other working class parties, or the immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Such passages, even they do actually point to a kind of discreteness or a separateness of the communists, and together with the title and the circumstances of the Communist Manifesto's writing, they indicate that Marx and Engels thought of the communists as some type of party or fledgling party. Another Soviet scholar who'd actually been a Menshevik and who actually disappeared in Stalin's purges, David Ryazanov, he wrote a very famous 1930 book on the circumstances of the Communist Manifesto. And he deals with this kind of issue of this separate party issue in quite a long passage that's quite interesting to kind of read out because of the background it highlights. Ryazanov says, the words communists do not form a separate party conflicting with other working class parties, Ryazanov's using a slightly different translation, might give rise to misunderstanding. They might mean, and some have erroneously supposed them to mean, that Marx and Engels were antagonistic on principle to the creation of a separate Communist Party. These words, however, must be interpreted in the light of historical circumstances in which the Communist League came into being. And Ryazanov adds that the League was obliged to order its relations towards its national sections in such a way as to avoid unnecessarily overlapping between these and any national parties that might exist. Such precautions were especially required in the case of England, where Chartism had become, above all, the political organisation of the working class. The English communists did not found a new party. They merely endeavoured to fuse Chartism and communism, to play the part of advance guard, and to place in the forefront of their discussion the question of property. Therefore, what Ryazanov's arguing is that this phrase appeared in the Communist Manifesto because the communists were not sectarian towards the Chartists, and so they didn't want to be seen as sectarian towards the Chartists. So in that instance, when they had that type of advanced political organization, not just a reformist organization, but an advanced organization that they saw had revolutionary potential, they obviously didn't want to form a sectarian party, because, as we know, Marx and Engels, although they developed ideas of separate parties, they were not in favor of forming sects, as is well known. Versus Hal Draper, in his book Adventures of the Communist Manifesto, he follows Ryazanov and argues that the wording of the manifesto on the issue of separate communist parties was more a case of Marx not wanting to be seen to be setting up an organizational rival to the Chartists in England, rather than a general prohibition on communist organization, i.e. it was a warning against sectarianism. Marx and Engels associated themselves with the left wing of Chartism around George Harney and Ernest Jones. I've made a note here as well. So already we're beginning to build up a fair wodge of evidence that this is using this passage in this contentious way to rule out separate communist organizations is very problematic in terms of the history, in terms of the theory involved. But there's quite a lot more kind of evidence and writing that point against it as well. Monty Johnson, who was he was a writer associated with the old CPGB, and did lots of kind of historical kind of examinations of these types of issues. Monty Johnson, he drew attention to the difficulty, and I quote, that during the lifetimes of Marx and Engels, the whole notion of a political party was to develop and change along with the forms of activity open to it. They were to use the term in several different senses without defining them. This means that it is problematic in the extreme to isolate one formulation on the party question from one specific period and use it as a kind of historical master key to unlock the whole kind of question of Marx and Engels on partyism. And as Johnson has also said, quite rightly, it has been quite possible to draw selectively on Marx and Engels' activities and above all their writings in support of the most opposite versions of their views, which is, I think what the process we're describing is one of those situations in which one section of their writings is being used to actually exemplify something that turns out to be actually quite opposite to the overall kind of structure and development of their thought. Johnston argued that Marx and Engels came to see communism and communist parties embodied after 1869 in the German socialist parties of August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht. Johnson also very usefully drew attention to the thoughts of Engels in relation to events in the French Workers' Party in 1882. Where there was a split, and I do apologize for my French pronunciation, and these I'm not a linguist, so I always I don't think I ever got more than 5% in a language examination at school, and I think this is possibly going to show in this next passage. So there was a split between the followers of Jules Guesde and the so-called possibilists around, I think it's Benoit and Malon and Paul Brosa. That's my best, is the best you're going to get out of me on those. And so basically, there was a split between Gassendi and the so-called possibilists. In the French parliamentary elections of 1881, an attempt had been made by Geoffrin, the French party's candidate in the 18th arrondissement of Paris, to attempt to win more votes by presenting working class demands so as to render them possible, i.e. opportunist. This issue was carried over into the French Workers' Party's Saint-Étienne Congress of September 1882. I can say Saint-Étienne because they were a band, and I think they're a football team, so I think that's why I can say that. French Workers' Party Saint-Étienne Congress of September 1882. Marx complained that the opportunist majority of the party around Milan and Broussa gutted its program of a proletarian class character, and that's quoting Engels. Engels added that the split of the irreconcilable elements around Gassendi was a good thing. In contrast to merely accepting large working class parties with mixed revolutionary reformist political antecedents as a fixed phenomenon, Engels said, and I quote, "It seems that every workers' party of a big country can develop only through internal struggle, which accords with the laws of dialectical development in general. In other words, even if there are organizations composed of revolutions and reformists, Engels didn't think that they were a stable and fixed phenomenon for all time, as some of our kind of wiseacres seem to think about the British Labour Party. This the kind of eternal organization that you constantly have to bow down before. Even more brutally for the assertion that Marx and Engels never argued for a separate communist organization, Engels opined on the French Workers' Party issue. He said, "To be for a moment in a minority with the correct program is still better than to have a big, but thereby almost nominal semblance of a following." So obviously in different circumstances, it was actually good for communists to be in a separate organization. Of course, in countries such as Britain and the US in the 19th century, where workers had historically been tied to bourgeois political organizations, broader non-communist workers' parties and movements such as Chartism could be seen as a distinct historical advance, and it would have been sectarian, obviously, to merely shout abuse at such organizations from the sidelines. And I think that's kind of well documented, that people know about those kind of issues. They've been covered a lot. But even here, Marx and Engels would have been highly unlikely to have judged such organizations as immune from what Engels saw as a generalized internal struggle between Marxists and reformists. Johnston argued on these views of Engels. Marx and Engels thought that sooner or later, many of these other parties would either come to adopt communist programs or be absorbed by others that had. In this belief, they were strengthened at the end of their lives by the example of German social democracy that was developing into the type of essentially communist mass party towards which they believed other workers' parties, from their different starting points and in their own national forms, would ultimately advance. So this isn't either about like setting up any kind of sectarian principle to walk away or to ignore like reformist workers' organizations. It's just what Marx and Engels and Johnston's kind of emphasizes, is they're looking at the overall kind of development of these types of formations, and there's nothing really within Marx and Engels other than this contentious passage that just says that they would frown on separate communist organizations. They would frown on separate communist sects being hatched in isolation from the broader workers' movement, but the issue of actual separateness and the need sometimes to be separate and the need to split and to break away, that's there in Engels as well. So that's some of the historical background. So I'm going to look now at Hal Draper and what he kind of argues about this contentious passage, i.e. the communists do not form separate parties, in the Adventures of the Communist Manifesto, which is like a very kind of scholarly kind of erudite book that Hal Draper wrote on this issue, on which he provided like various different translations and investigated the context of the passages within the Communist Manifesto is actually it's actually very interesting, even for me, who's somebody. I'm not a great reader of I'm not a great reader of programs in their kind of bold kind of form, but Draper's kind of outline of the kind of circumstances and conditions and debates around the program is very interesting. So Draper takes issue with a particular sentence used in the 1888 authorized English translation, which we've remarked on: the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class party. Draper retranslates this sentence from the 1848 German edition of the manifesto into a much kind of milder formulation. Draper's translation of that passage is the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties. That's his translation based on, I can't really go into it would be too confusing, and my German is even worse than my French, and I'm sure Ben and Zuri could explain some of the German translation issues much better than I can. So I'm not going to go into that, but it's just basically to take away from this that Draper's translation is the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties. And Draper argued, and this is me quoting him, he said that the English translation sentence makes 3 tactical errors in translation, conveying a plainly misleading idea to most readers. And Draper also questioned why the English translation had changed the German original, the communists are not, to the communists do not form. And Draper says, was it really true that the communists did not set up a separate organization? Why they had just done so in establishing the Communist League? And he puts an exclamation mark there. The English translation sounds like a denial of this obvious fact, whereas the original was making a statement about the non-sectist character of the special, i.e. special not separate, organization just established. So therefore, if you look into kind of Draper's work, you'll see like he's actually taken up the technicalities of the translation. He's saying separate should be rendered as special, and he says and do not form should be rendered as the communists are not. So when you actually change those kind of words and you end up with Draper's formulation, the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the Workers' Party. Well, again, you could kind of argue with you could argue with that. Why would they not want to make it a special party in the sense of being an excellent kind of discrete thing? But special is very different from separate. So I think that's when you read Draper, it becomes kind of clear that he's got some fundamental kind of issues with the translation. And as I say, he boils it all down into the specific uses of German words, which is in that sense, not being a German, most of my German was learned from comics when in this 1970s about the Second World War. So it wasn't much help to me in interpreting that. Okay. So from the many kind of we've reached a whole heap of kind of like layers of objections. We had the objection that follows through Marx and Engels' kind of writings on party and partyism, and you can find completely contradictory examples from the passage in the Communist Manifesto. There's also the objection that Marx and Engels were concerned above all else not to want to be sectarian towards the Chartist organization, and there's the translation kind of objections. So there's quite a heap of evidence kind of against this, and for not taking this passage that the communists do not form a separate party on face value. It becomes clear at least that the theory of Marx and Engels somehow forswore in 1848 that communists should not form separate class communist organizations in relation to class reformist ones. It's not a stable and secure kind of theory at all. It's not it's not something that really kind of stands up. And in some senses, you could say that it's kind of historically and kind of theoretically illiterate in the extreme, actually, to argue this. But given that such views, they're not, these views and this quoting of this passage isn't a pure creation of groups like Socialist Appeal. But while it's obvious that they want to use that passage in this way, it's equally clear that this kind of deliberate misinterpretation, it didn't arise with Socialist Appeal and the Trotskyist movement. It had much kind of longer antecedents. And in the kind of final part, I'll talk about some of the antecedents of this theory and where it came from. An early example of the deformed usage of the manifesto to claim that communists do not form a separate party, it comes from the Independent Labour Party. In 1910, Keir Hardie, who was the leader of the ILP, he drew attention, as do Socialist Appeal, as do the AWL and all the other, the rest of the trot groups who use this. He drew attention to the aforementioned passage from Proletarians and Communists. The communists do not form a separate party. And Hardie used this as a justification for his own non-communist organization, the Independent Labour Party. And this is how he put it. The socialist movement was not to be a thing apart from the general working class movement with its own tests and dogma, but an integral part of the movement, merely acting as the advance guard, careful all the time not to get so far ahead as to get out of touch with the main body of the army. And this is exactly what the ILP is and has always been. The trade union movement is the real movement of the working class, and the ILP is the advance wing. And that was what Marx intended the socialist section of the working class movement to be. And Hardie went on to make the bold assertion that Marx did not ask the working class to unite as class conscious socialists, but only as working men. So this is a clear kind of use of that that Communist Manifesto phrase. And what Hardie's quite kind of cleverly conflating, he's conflating the kind of non-sectarianism that the Communist Manifesto outlines with this more controversial kind of assertion that Marx did not ask the working class to unite as class-conscious socialists. I mean, it's rather idealist way of putting it, actually, that Marx just somehow asked the working class to unite as class-conscious socialists, because clearly Marx was relating to an historical movement, but leaving that aside. The Fabian writer, G.D.H. Cole, he outlined a kind of similar thesis. He had a book called What Marx Really Meant in 1934. I haven't found that book contains much of what Marx really meant at all. Perhaps I'm just a cynic. G.D.H. Cole said, "I am no Marxist if to be one involves, as many of his followers seem to suppose, unquestioned acceptance of all his doctrines and even a belief in the literal inspiration of all the Marxian scriptures. But I am Marxist to the extent I have found in certain of his doctrines, and above all in his methods of social analysis, clearer light than anywhere else by which to seek an understanding of the fundamental economic and political problems of today." Well, that's very nice, isn't it? However, this kind of fealty to the methods of Marx's social investigation was grouped, like Hardie, to a denial of a specific Marxist organization. Rather, Cole looked to the existing mass organizations of the proletariat, trade unions, cooperative societies, and the Labour Party as instruments both of working class defence and of the furtherance of socialist policy. So this kind of theory really in Britain, so far as I can see, this interpretation of Marx, it actually arises in the form of like reformist organizations, as I'd see them, such as the ILP and the Labour Party. This is where this kind of it kind of arises, and it's kind of just prior to the First World War, the Socialist International had a unity kind of campaign based on some of their conference, international conference kind of resolutions on socialist unity, and there was an attempt with the International Socialist Bureau's supervision to get the British Socialist Party and the ILP to join together to fuse in one organization, because both the BSP and the ILP had voted for these resolutions. I think it was either the 1909 or 1910 Second International Congress. And so, but within that debate, which I've kind of looked at some length, this kind of idea only that communists do not form separate parties, it doesn't actually really, even the ILP in practice, they were actually much better when, because the debate kind of got hung up, and the ILP and the International Socialist Bureau insisted that the British Socialist Party went into the Labour Party, which at that time was much more of an affiliated organisation, and you could stand your own candidates under a Labour Party banner, but you could stand them under your own programmatic statements. You could stand them under your own, with your own newspapers, with your own writing, with your own policy, kind of thing. I'm crudely overemphasizing that for time, but basically the ILP were actually much better than the BSP in working out and telling the BSP that, well, if you go into the Labour Party, you don't have to accept everything that every Labour Party member says. You can stand under your own platform, you can stand under your own banner, so to speak. The ILP in practice, as opposed to what Hardy was, did actually recognise the kind of need for separate organisations within the context of the Labour Party. And it was actually the BSP, whose members were, quite a lot of those members, contrary to popular opinion, were very keen to get in the Labour Party. They were actually the ones who kind of struggled with this idea that they argued in meetings that, oh, if we go in the Labour Party, we'll just have to argue like liberals and Lib Labs. And the ILP said no. But the one kind of thing that the ILP did practically take in this debate is the ILP funneled this debate all the time, i.e. the debate about whether they should unite with the ILP and the BSP. It seems like the ILP insisted, well, you must join the Labour Party first. So even though in practice the ILP were better at seeing the practice of separate organisations within broader affiliated movements, they were quite insistent that the BSP actually did put its forces inside the Labour Party, and they seem to establish it at times as a kind of precondition for the debate, although that was also the viewpoint of the International Socialist Bureau leadership as well. So the ILP, I would say, was slightly better in practice than they were in theory over this separate issue. And they were, it's really weird when you look at organisations like the ILP, sometimes in practice, their politics were like far to the left of modern day revolutionary organisations on certain issues and certain points, such as this, they were quite advanced. Although I'm not advocating that the ILP is an organisation to copy or to reform or anything daft like that. Okay, I'm now going to come on to the most notable Labour Party figure to misuse the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. Now you've probably heard me talking about him before, and I've written a long and boring article on this topic on my blog that if you're desperate enough, you can read after this. I'll send the link round. But yeah, the Labour Party's theoretician Harold Laski, he wrote an introduction to the Labour Party's republication of the Communist Manifesto in 1948. 100 years of the Communist Manifesto, the Labour Party relaunched it. And Laski wrote a big, long 100-page odd introduction to this, justifying the Labour Party's support, in quote marks, for the Communist Manifesto. Laski made use of the passage, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. He used it no less than 9 times in his long introduction. So he was very keen on this idea. And it was clear that this was, it was clear also that it was a case of special pleading for non-communist organisations such as the British Labour Party. Laski argued that the position of Marx and Engels was unmistakable. He said that Marx and Engels will always support working class parties, even when these are not communists, without forming a separate party of their own. Even though such a party may have an inadequate programme, its proletarian character makes it the appropriate instrument through which to exercise communist influence. He added, and this is where it becomes really kind of, well, bollocks, to use a technical term. The idea of a separate communist party dates from the Russian Revolution. It had no place in the thought of Marx and Engels. Well, as I've illustrated, that's transparently not the case. In other words, Labour rivals such as the CPGB and similar parties were illegitimate as against non-communist social democratic bodies such as the Labour Party. The CPGB in 1948 was a political pygmy compared to the Labour Party of that era, but it was still an influence on the Labour left in Parliament, and that's why the Labour leadership agreed to Lasky doing this work on the Communist Manifesto to undermine this idea that the communists, to undermine the communists by professing the idea that the Communist Manifesto says you shouldn't form a separate communist party. They thought this was a good route to counter the CPGB, which we, as I say, did have an influence on the left in Parliament, and that could embarrass the Labour Party sometimes, particularly on international kind of debates. There's quite a lot of work done on that. There was various kind of there was the Communist Party within the Parliamentary Labour Party had varying kind of degrees of kind of like hidden. To call them hidden communists wouldn't be that, but there will be certain Labour MPs who would follow the line of the Communist Party, and the CPGB, as we kind of know, was a major influence on the Labour left anyway, given that the Labour left generally doesn't have very many worthwhile ideas about anything in the 20th century, so it relied on the Communist Party to provide that kind of intellectual kind of succor to it. But Lasky also had his own particular reason for wanting to undermine the CPGB. Lasky was sympathetic to the Soviet Union's position on some international issues, but he felt that the actions of a rogue organization such as the CPGB would only poison the well of future Anglo-Soviet relations. So he actually wanted to like smash up the Communist Party to make Anglo-Soviet relations better and to give Stalin more of a voice in international affairs, which is kind of strange position, but in some ways it was a kind of quintessential kind of popular front kind of standpoint. It was kind of a vision of the national Soviet Union without the encumbrance of the Comintern and all its various kind of parties, and particularly in Britain, where parties that didn't generally have a high reputation in the Labour movement, not in the Labour Party anyway, because there's various nefarious disputes that had happened in the 30s and 40s. So this is where this interpretation comes from. This interpretation comes from the ILP, it comes from the Labour Party, and it comes from Fabian's, this interpretation of the Communist Manifesto, that the communists do not form a separate parties. It comes from those organizations, and it comes from those organizations policing organizations to their left. So, and that it also kind of, that would raise up the question of why Trotskyist organizations want to use it, which I'll come on to in the conclusion shortly. But this interpretation of the Communist Manifesto that has been adopted by groups who make a fetish of Labour Party work or fetishize social democratic organizations, it's not a natural interpretation. You don't have to make this. For example, Lasky's estimation of the party question in the context of 1948 that I've just quoted to you, it appeared to be very different from his earlier understanding in 1921, when the Comintern's organization of specific organizations was in its infancy. Back then, Lasky in 1921, he felt no need to concentrate on the formulation that the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class party. Instead, the manifesto was seen to have begun, and I quote Lasky, begun the long process of welding together the scattered groups of the disinherited into an organized and influential party, which is a different and it's a much less ideological emphasis from that of 1948. The philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote an 1896 book called German Social Democracy, and Russell introduces himself as writing from the point of view of as a kind of orthodox liberal. But it's quite interesting when you read Russell's book, which is actually quite interesting and it's quite good in some ways. It's kind of this idea of giving given an English audience, this kind of view of German social democracy, this like amazing organization that's got its tentacles everywhere kind of thing. It was that kind of project. But when Russell looks at things like issues of party organization and Marx's Engels' emphasis in the Communist Manifesto, Russell says he reaches the conclusion everywhere the communists support all revolutionary parties whose fundamental motive is always the question of property. So you could argue with the second part of that kind of sentence, but Russell has read the Communist Manifesto and he reaches the conclusion that communists support all revolutionary parties. And also as well, writers such as the historian E.H. Carr were highly critical of Lasky's interpretation in 1948. In fact, E.H. Carr wrote a serious review of Lasky's introduction in the Times Literary Supplement, so of the time, and basically Carr just absolutely traduces Lasky's interpretation and just basically says it's kind of false, but I don't really have time to go into it here. But it's also too important to realize that the misinterpretation of the communists do not form a separate party passage. It doesn't emanate formally from the official communist movement either. CPGB writers of the time tackled Lasky's "don't form a separate party" thesis of 1948 with some alacrity, seeing Lasky's constant reiteration of the point as the weak hinge upon which his critique of the world communist movement depended. Both Emil Burns and Andrew Rothstein, two CPGB activists and writers, they drew attention to the fact that the actual title of the document that Lasky discussed was Manifesto of the Communist Party, which was embarrassingly but faithfully reproduced on page 105 of the Labour Party's 1948 reissue. Burns and Rothstein also argued that Lasky hadn't explained other sentences of the section proletarians and communists in the manifesto that did in fact suggest the idea of a more distinctive communist parties, which I've already pointed to. Rothstein argued that such passages, together with the title, indicate that Marx and Engels thought of the communists as the party. And on balance, you'd have to say the CPGB had much the better of the debate in 1948. Backed up by observers such as E.H. Carr. And of course, this was a key existential question for the party in that period. There's no way that CPGB could come out and agree with the contention that the communists do not form a separate party. They were revisionist, but they weren't that revisionist at that point. It would have undermined the whole rationale for their existence. Even in the Khrushchev post-Stalin era, which some in our movement of the time are judged to be a period of wholesale theoretical revisionism, Soviet historians were generally keen to look for precedents in Marx and Engels, even in prototype form of the somewhat kind of more Baroque party institutions of official communism. There was this bitter controversy between the Soviet historian E.P. Kandel, I've already mentioned, and an old Menshevik called Boris Nikolevsky, in the late 50s and early 60s, around the alleged dissolution of the Communist League in 1848. As might be expected, the Soviets were keen to refute this, but Nikolevsky's usefully outlined some of the reasons for this Soviet denial during the polemic. Following the revelations of the Khrushchev speech and the invasion of Hungary in 1956, official communism had become fractured as many left the movement and argued that the Stalinist movement of the democratic centralism, as they called it, was untenable. In fact, they meant bureaucratic centralism, but we'll leave that aside. And the grouping around E.P. Thompson and the New Reasoner in Britain would be the British equivalent of this kind of grouping. To combat this, the Soviet leadership, followed by the British party leadership, adopted some of the language of its left wing in campaigning against revisionism and liquidation in relation to its party formations. This meant a skeptical approach to anyone, such as Lasky, who questioned Marx and Engels' credibility in Communist Party building stakes. It was only really later, during the emergence of the Euro-Communist wing, and I don't really have time to go into that, although it is interesting, that this adherence to separate communist organisation came to be more formally questioned in the official communist movement. The Euros came to see that the split of the second and third internationals as a historical mistake that had to be glued back together. Of course, while organisations such as the CPGB, they may have been formally correct, historically and theoretically, they had their own form of programmatic subservience to the Labour Party in the form of the British Road to Socialism, which fundamentally envisaged the Communist Party acting as little helpers of the Labour Party in initiating the first steps of socialism. In practice, this idea proved to be just as liquidationist for the left and right of the CPGB. The official communist movement wasn't formally culpable for promoting this separate party thesis idea, but they were culpable in their actual practice, which led to their liquidation. So I'm just I've gone over time a bit, but I'm just going to conclude now. Then, so one would have to say that using the Communist Manifesto as a tool to argue against the formation of separate Marxist or communist parties, in opposition to existing reformist organisations of the working class, it is historically and theoretically illiterate. It simply doesn't stand up to serious investigation and seems sometimes to just be a case of willful misinterpretation on the part of groups such as Socialist Appeal and the AWL who wield it. However, I would say this theory, which maps onto sect shibboleths and justifications for sect existence and practice, it's not really aimed at people such as me, and it's not probably aimed at the audience of this kind of talk. Rather, it's aimed at the centre and the right of the Labour Party and non-Marxists, i.e. whom these groups kind of believe they are appealing to. Appealing to the right of the Labour Party on the basis of your non-separateness from the Labour Party as a whole, and as a kind of Marxist consciousness of reformism, which is actually how Marxists and the Labour Party have tended in the main to function down the years. It merely feeds the appetite of the Labour bureaucracy to police such elements, and as happened recently to witch hunt them. It also breeds a certain kind of quietism in your kind of politics, this idea of non-separateness with a predisposition towards unity with the right and the centre, which is the basic kind of stumbling block of Labour left politics. This kind of theory that the communists do not form a separate party doesn't lead directly to this. It's much more mediated than that, but it's kind of a background idea that just formulates a certain quietism. It's certainly true that boldly stating your Marxist independence as a faction, that's unlikely to get you very far in the current environment either, but that's due to the kind of inherent weakness of the Marxist left in the current period. But I would say about that, at least it doesn't automatically breed opportunism and the dreadful spectacle of ex-Trotskyist Labour leftists resigningly hanging on to the next Labour government like a spinster clinging on to a boiled egg sandwich at a wake. That's it.